Hi, this is Tim MacDonald with Sumo Logic. I'm the Channel Technical Director, and today I would like to talk to you about automating the potential workflows with Sumo Logic APIs. So why would we want to do that? It depends on who you are and what your goals are. If you are a end user of the Sumo Logic product, you may very well just want to automate a repetitive task and save yourself some time, which of course potentially could translate into saving yourself cost as well. Or if you are a Sumo Logic partner, you may want to create a repeatable process that you can use when you're provisioning new customer accounts, or you may want to do a combination of those things. So typically, the reasons for using the Sumo Logic API are going to fall into one of these three categories: cost savings, time savings, and accuracy and consistency. Just remember, regardless of which one of these is your goal, that it's probably not a good idea to automate everything. Some things are best left done as a one-off. So with that in mind, let's move forward and talk a little bit about automation in the context of Sumo Logic. Before we get into the APIs, I want to touch on a very specific scenario, which is automated deployment of installed collectors. So people hear the term automation, and a lot of time the questions I get revolve around this topic specifically, which is how can I automate the installation of the installed collector component of the Sumo Logic platform. And whilst this is definitely an automation topic, it is actually not an API topic, at least not fully. So you cannot deploy an installed collector through the API. The installed collector actually has to already be in place for the API to configure an installed collector. So the actual installation of installed collectors needs to be done externally to the Sumo Logic product. The good news is that there's plenty of people that have tackled this problem out there, and there's a variety of methods that you can use and a variety of external tools that you can use. And so some of those would be things like Chef and Puppet and Ansible and Salt and Terraform. If you're in the AWS cloud, then you could use something called CloudFormation template, which I'm sure you're familiar with, or just bake our collector into the AMI. There's also other tools available for the other cloud platforms like guest policies and desired state configuration, Cloud Init, and maybe sometimes you just want to go ahead and just script it out using something like a Bash or PowerShell. So all of those options are available to you. And later on at the end of the deck, I will include a set of links to some open source tools and some open source recipes that you can use to achieve this. Once you have your installed collector deployed, then you can use the API to configure the sources that you want that collector to actually collect. So we will talk about configuring sources in depth, but just remember that before you can use the API to configure collection on an installed collector, you need to actually have that installed collector deployed first. So moving on to the actual API automation, what will you need to perform that automation? Well, there's a couple of things. You're going to need an API key and accompanying secret. So this is very much like any other set of credentials that you might get from a cloud service. The API key and the secret are randomly generated for you. You give it a name and that key set, and they're presented to you once in the UI. So the way that you do that is you go to your username on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. You select preferences. On the preferences page, you can choose to add an access key. At which point it'll ask you to name the key, and then it'll give you the access give you a copy of that access key in the UI for you to actually copy into your clipboard. Now, at this point, you have to save your access key and secret because you will not be given access to them again, Sumo Logic will only present this to you once at creation time. So save those someplace safe. And so that's what you're going to use to authenticate into the API key or into the Sumo Logic API rather. And so what you're going to want to make sure you do is, if you're going to do administrative type tasks with the API, you want to make sure that the user that you're using to generate this key has administrative privileges. If you do not have administrative privileges, then you're not going to be able to perform those tasks based on the role-based access control system within Sumo Logic. So set yourself up for success and make sure that the user that you are using to generate your key pair has the rights that you need to perform your task. Create the key pair, download the key pair. The other thing you're going to need to do is identify your API endpoint. So this is the URL that the API is going to connect to, or that your whatever your client is going to connect to perform API tasks. So you are going to need to look at your browser when you log into the Sumo Logic UI. If you look at the browser URL bar, it'll give you a hint as to which instance of Sumo Logic you're connecting to. And you can then look up the associated API endpoint by following the link here at the bottom of this slide. So if you go to that, you can compare your URL to the ones listed on that web page, and then find your accompanying API endpoint. So these are going to be things like US2 or Dub or FRA for Frankfurt. There's one SYD for Sydney. So it'll become pretty apparent to you once you've identified what your Sumo Logic instance URL is. Now, once you have these things, then it's time to identify how you want to talk to the API. So there are multiple mechanisms that you can use to leverage the Sumo Logic API, and they fall into two general categories. One is direct REST access. So this is where you're actually calling the REST API directly over HTTPS. And so there's a variety of APIs available for you to access through REST. There's a search job API, which you can use to actually run Sumo Logic searches. There are collector and source APIs for configuring collectors and sources. We're going to be doing a lot of that today. There's users and roles if you want to create users or roles as part of a provisioning process. You can manipulate content, so importing and exporting dashboards and searches. You can create and import and export field extraction rules and partitions. And you can also manipulate other configurations such as SAML and tokens and ingest budgets. And there's more APIs coming. So Sumo Logic has taken an API first approach to this. So to our product, and so everything that you can do in the UI, you should eventually be able to do in the API. So there's a lot of power here, but of course this is also can be a bit fidgety because there's a lot of sort of technical acumen required to do direct API access. There's potentially a lot of steps. To ease that, we do have a variety of SDKs that have been created, mostly by the community. So there's a Python SDK. There's actually multiple Python SDKs, and we'll be talking about that later. There's also PowerShell, Ruby, Java, Golang. These are mostly open source APIs that are SDKs that are available and were created by the community. So some of them are going to be more or less complete than others, but they're all available on GitHub. And I will also include a slide at the end of this deck that will have links to these APIs or these SDKs that you can leverage. And by the way, this deck should be available for you to download, and so you can take advantage of all the links that I've put in this. On the other side of this slide I'm presenting, we actually have another option for accessing the APIs, which is to access them through some third-party tools. One of which is the Sumo Logic Terraform provider. So this is available from GitHub at the link that's listed. There is also a project called Sumo Logic Commandlets. This is by one of the Sumo Logic sales engineers, and this provides shell level commands, so command line executables that can pull data directly out of the Sumo Logic API. And then also there's a project called Sumo Toolbox. This is actually my personal project, and this is a GUI interface that allows you to perform some common tasks from a UI instead of from within a script. So if you are potentially light on scripting in terms of your personal skill set, or if you simply just don't have the time to write scripts or prefer not to, the Sumo Toolbox may be of use to you for performing some common sort of day one, day two tasks that come up. If you want to create a repeatable full end-to-end automation, though, you're probably going to want to leverage something that can be scheduled and can be run without interaction. So that would take you back to either the direct REST access or through third-party tools like Commandlets and Terraform. Excuse me. So I did want to mention some example use cases. So some of these use cases are going to be primarily aimed at direct users or people that are managing collectors. So this is a very common use case to manage collectors and of course the sources that are defined for those collectors. So whether that's around provisioning or updating those collectors and sources, those are things that everybody can take advantage of, and that's what we're going to focus on mainly today. But also, if you're a Sumo Logic partner, you may also want to leverage some of the other APIs for creating and automating the deployment and provisioning of new Sumo Logic orgs. And so, you might want to do things like create new users, or create a default set of partitions, or replicate content in the form of dashboards and searches and alerts between orgs as well. And so those are all sort of potential use cases. The other things that you might want to do is do sort of a mass update of content. We've seen this before where somebody had an existing set of content that maybe needed to have the source categories updated or something along those lines. That's another potential management use case. And then finally, obviously, we do have the search URL, or the search API, and the search API would allow you to run any Sumo Logic query and return that the results of that query through the API rather than through the UI. And so the sky's the limit with that. That feature is potentially limited based on your license, though. I believe that's limited to enterprise customers, although I might be wrong. So let's look at how we can implement some of these use cases. And so I'm going to start with a very simple one. Now, all of my scripted examples are going to be in Python, but there are, as I mentioned, other ways to do this. It just happens to be that I am a Python programmer, at least an amateur one, and so these are easiest for me to implement in Python. It's also a nice kind of cross-platform language. One thing you will notice here is that I'm importing a Sumo Logic module here at the very beginning of this script, and in fact, from every script that you see, that line number 1, import from modules to .sumo logic, import Sumo Logic. So that is actually a custom Sumo Logic SDK module that I've created that has more content than what's available in our community SDK. So this is what I would recommend that you use if you're trying to replicate the results or the scripts that you see here. I've uploaded this module as well as the sample scripts that are in these screenshots to GitHub. And so they are available separately as a separate GitHub project so that you can download these and you don't have to retype them in, and so that you can also leverage this Sumo Logic module that I'm including here. In the future, I do hope to merge the module that I've created with the Python community project, and so the there won't be two any longer. They'll just be the one. But for now, if you want to replicate what I'm doing here on your own, please do download the project that's specific, the specific examples from this presentation. And again, there'll be a link at the end of the deck. So let's talk about what's happening in this slide. So first of all, line 1 and 2 are simple Python imports. We're just bringing in data, bringing in the modules we're going to leverage. So the Sumo Logic module, which I created, and then the standard JSON module. Now, if you don't have familiarity with JSON, you're probably going to want to get at least a basic familiarity with JSON. Stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it is a pretty common, well, it is the de facto standard method for transferring data back and forth over REST APIs. And so that's what all of our APIs are going to require, that when you want to configure something or define something, it's going to be defined within a JSON context. And there's actually some of that here in this script. So we'll get down to that in a minute. So after we've imported Sumo Logic and JSON, we are going to import, or we're going to define our key and our secret. So remember, those are the secrets that you created in the UI and stored in a safe place. Line 6 has the endpoint. So this is our API endpoint. So if you've provisioned an account or a trial in the US region, you're commonly going to end up getting the US2 instance of Sumo Logic, but there is another one. And then, of course, there's other instances. There's Canada and Dublin and Frankfurt, et cetera. So make sure you set your endpoint correctly. If you don't have this set properly, you will not succeed. And then in this case, we are creating a source. And so remember what I said, you have to have your collector, your installed collector defined. The source that we're creating here is a local file source. So since we already have the installed collector, we have to be able to target that. And in this case, I'm targeting that installed collector by name. So that's what line 7 is doing. We're specifying the name of the collector that we're going to add the source to. And then lines 9 through 24, this is the actual source definition, and this is the actual JSON. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack in here. I'm not going to fill it all, or I'm not going to, sort of go through every line in here, but basically these are the configuration options that you would see in the UI when you defined a file source, except in this case, they're in text. And so we've got things like automatic date parsing turned on or off, multi-line processing turned on and off. Filters would be processing rules, things that we want to potentially include or exclude. There are none here. That would be line 17, but we could have them. There's a file encoding. There's, of course, the actual file itself, the path to that file, which is line 21. The source type, which is line 23. There's other things that could be here. So this is just one example of the JSON that you might use to define a source. And this is going to be specific to a file source. What I would suggest for you is that you would leverage the Sumo Logic API documentation on the website, on the Sumo Logic help.sumologic.com website, to kind of understand what these should look like. Another great tool, it was to actually use the source configuration UI. There's a little I button on the far right of every source and of every collector. And if you click on that, that will show you the underlying JSON that's being used to configure that source or that collector. And so you can sort of copy out of your existing sources in the UI, see what that JSON would look like, and then leverage that within your scripts. So in any case, so here we are at defining a source, and then to actually implement this and configure the collector with this source, all we're doing is we're setting up our Sumo Logic SDK here on line 25. This is, we're passing it the key and the secret and the endpoint, and implement. This is instancing an object within Python. So this is our Sumo Logic SDK object. And then we're calling that sumo_org. We're leveraging that object, specifically the getCollectorByName method, to retrieve the source collector that we're going to use. The reason we're doing this is because we actually need the source collector ID number and not the name. So by doing this, we're retrieving a bunch of information about the source collector, and then we're going to take the ID out of that source collector and pass it back into the create source method along with our source JSON to actually create that source on line 27. And so that will perform the task for us. And at the end of this, if we run the script, of course, having put the appropriate keys and secrets in here, then this will execute and create the source on the collector named test collector 01. Now, I do have another example here. So this is one that is pretty common, wanting to delete dead collectors, but by name. So maybe you have a group of collectors that all start with the same substring. Maybe they all start with like PC or workstation, and you want to delete all of the collectors that are no longer alive, meaning that those endpoints have potentially been deprovisioned. So that's what this little script does. So same top part, right? Import the Sumo logic module, import the key secret endpoint. Number 8, this is a Python list. So actually you can have multiple values here. So in this case, I'm using the word Kali because my workstation's name is Kali, but you could, again, put any string match you want in here. So it could be Bob or PC or workstation or whatever you like. And then we're going to, again, instantiate the Sumo logic object with your key and secret and endpoint in number 9. We're going to get a list of collectors from the org. And so I just want to mention here, we're using that instantiated endpoint, this instantiated object, sumo_org, to do a get collectors sync. So get collectors is a call that can pass a limited number of results back, up to 1,000 collectors. This is a get collectors would be a direct API call, and but it can only return up to 1,000 collectors. If you return more than 1,000 collectors, if you have more than 1,000 collectors, then you have to make multiple calls to the API to get those results back. So it's a paging system. It'll give you the first X number of collectors, and then another page of collectors, and then another page. You have to make multiple calls until you run out of collectors to retrieve. So the code to do that is not super complicated, but it's more complicated than some people care to implement on their own. So what I've done within this particular SDK is I've implemented synchronous calls that do that sort of looping for you. And so you'll see sync calls again and again inside of that SDK, not just for getting collectors, but for getting other stuff too. And so what that basically means is that you can leverage my sync call and not have to implement your own sort of algorithm for retrieving pages and pages of collectors. So the reason it's called sync, of course, for synchronous, and that would be versus asynchronous, since technically our API is asynchronous for a lot of these get calls. So where you see a sync, feel free to leverage that. It can help you out and save you a bunch of coding. Once we have our list of collectors, then we're going to iterate through them, look for all of the collectors that are dead, so not alive. And then we're just looking to match the name of the collector with this substring. So basically, if the string is in the name of the collector, then delete it. If it's dead and it matches, then delete that collector. And that's it. And that'll go through and delete as many collectors as you want. Just be very careful, and be careful with all of these scripts. They're not these scripts I created for the purposes of this presentation, and they're not heavily tested, and of course they're presented as is. These are open source tools that are not supported by Sumo Logic. They're just simply examples that you can leverage to sort of get started automating the API. So one more, this one's more complicated, but this one basically copies a bunch of sources out to collectors. We're not going to go through this one. It's a bit more complex, but the same concepts are in place here. Now, I did mention there was Sumo Toolbox. Sumo Toolbox is the UI component, or the UI project that I've created to help you perform similar tasks. So this is the UI version of this. So rather than writing a script, you can actually click and highlight on your, collectors and sources, copy them from place to place, manipulate them, delete them, back them up, etc. So if we wanted to perform the same task of copying sources between multiple collectors, that's something that we could do using the UI tool. Another use case would be to update processing rules with the UI tool. The UI tool has quite a lot of functionality. We're certainly not going to collect it all, or we're not going to cover it all here. But I did want to leave you with a few screenshots. Again, it might be something that you want to leverage. And finally, if you find any of this useful, do go download download this presentation. That'll give you access to these resource slides at the end. This one that has resources for how to deploy installed collectors. And then finally, this slide, which has resources on the APIs and the different SDKs available. Notice that the last slide, or the last item here, is the actual examples and SDK that I've used in this particular presentation. So with that, I want to thank you for attending Illuminate and attending this talk. I hope that this was somewhat useful. It's a huge subject, and obviously it's very difficult to do this subject justice within a 20-minute presentation, but hopefully this at least gives you some idea of what's available out in the open source world for accessing Sumo Logic APIs, and some of the ways that you can use the APIs to make your life a little easier using Sumo Logic. Thank you very much.